Well, welcome to another segment in our 2020 Summit Pathway entitled Seeking Peace Through Restorative Justice. My name is Chris Riley, and I serve as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, Criminal Justice here at ACU. And today I'm excited to be joined by Justin Barringer to discuss spiritual roots of restorative justice. Justin is a pastor and a scholar pursuing a PhD in religious ethics at SMU, where he's taught a course on restorative justice and received numerous fellowships and awards for his research and writing related to nonviolence, the prison industrial complex, and civil rights. Justin has a BA in communication from Lipscomb University and an MDiv from Asbury Theological Seminary, where he focused on Christian ethics. He's been a missionary in Greece and China and served as an outreach minister in two different congregational contexts. His latest book, entitled The Business of War, Theological and Ethical Reflections on the Military-Industrial Complex, comes out in October. Perhaps best of all, Justin is the husband of Rachel and the father of Israel and Zoe. Justin, is that a long enough introduction for you?
That's great. I love that last part.
Okay, good.
I'm happy to be married to Rachel. I'm happy to have our little boy and little girl, Israel and Zoe. And I think I usually add on to that, and a friend of God. So
okay, that'll work.
That goes together.
Sounds good. Well, Justin, thank you for being here and spending some time with us. I know this is not what we intended. We first talked about this a while back, but we're still very glad to have you on Zoom and be able to talk about this today. To get us started, just tell us a little bit about what brought you to this work.
So for me, I started by working for a church in Kentucky that happened to have a number of regular attenders who spent time on and off being incarcerated. We were working in a neighborhood, in a context where there was just a lot of violence and drugs and different things. And so I started making visits as the outreach pastor there to folks at the local jail. And then around the same time, I got a second job, had to be bivocational, as a lot of folks understand, with a rescue mission. And I helped run a transitional living facility for men, most of whom were coming out of incarceration, but also who had drug and alcohol issues. And so I kind of started there. I don't know if we'd call any of it restorative justice, but that kind of, I don't want to say put my foot in the door in prison, but you know, opened that up for me. And then it was when I came down here to Texas that my advisor, D. Stephen Long, and I started collaborating on doing research for a class on restorative justice, which we then taught. And I don't know that I've kind of got my fingers crossed. It was scheduled to be in the spring for us to have it, but since a component of it is actually visiting men recently released from incarceration, I'm not sure if we're gonna be able to make it happen this spring, but it's a class that I hope will continue to go on at SMU, you know, regardless. So that's a little background of how I've gotten into all this.
Okay. And so kind of what is your work now in restorative justice? You mentioned the class, you mentioned a little bit about the population, but what is your work, and kind of what have you found to be helpful or successful in those practices?
Yeah, so I am an academic. So a lot of my work has to do with research, writing, and teaching. So we teach this class and we take students, like I said, primarily seminary students. I think last time we had one law student and a bunch of seminary students, and work with these men who've been released from incarceration. And we run through a program that I'll talk more about in a little while called Bridges to Life, amazing organization. And then I do some reading and writing. So right now I'm co-editing a series on various industrial complexes, and one of them is going to be a book on the prison industrial complex. We're calling it, I think, The Business of Incarceration. We hope to have it finished up middle of next year, and maybe it might come out the end of next year or possibly the early part of next year. So business of incarceration. And one of the chapters in that is most definitely going to be on restorative justice. I'm trying to rope in one of the leaders at Bridges to Life so we can get a real practical standpoint. And looking at the business of, we're asking questions in that one, like, what does it cost to run this program, let's say, and it reduces recidivism rates drastically compared to what it costs to keep somebody in prison, right? And so looking at all those numbers along with all the other ethical issues involved. So that's just a brief rundown of kind of what I'm involved in. And then just sort of me and my pastor and some other friends and stuff, we also have done some events around the death penalty, and we work with folks that come in and out of our outreach campus who've been incarcerated and try to help with meeting various needs there.
Okay, great. Well, as you've done that research and writing, talk to us a little bit about, I know there's different origin stories as far as restorative justice practices. What have you learned in your research related to kind of the spiritual foundations of restorative justice?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of, it's anachronistic maybe, but we see this all the way back in the Old Testament. There's a Hebrew word, tzedekah, which means, and Hebrew professors out there are probably cringing at how I pronounce that, but this word's used something like 450 times in the Old Testament, and it's a word that's means justice. But what's interesting about it is that most often when it's used, it seems to have an idea of what's the outcome of justice. So it's not simply the way we often talk about justice today is let's just get somebody punished for it, right? You know, we talk about some of the really awful crimes that have happened that have been on the news, and we say, let's get justice for the family, and we mean by that, let's punish someone, right? But this word and this practice in the Old Testament was looking at how do you restore community. And so it involved a variety of community actors usually, and it was about restoring these relationships and about restoring the place of someone who has committed a crime back into society. And it also helps the idea of people who've been victims of crime, trying to help them find their place in society. And of course, you know, one of the ways we think about the people of God's vocation is the ministry of reconciliation. And so we see all the way running through the Old Testament. And the way that I sort of summed it up is that chesed leads to shalom. That's one of those Hebrew words that usually is translated loving kindness. Hesed is, and you have to, you know, put that nice sound in the throat there. But the idea is that loving kindness leads to peace and wholeness and shalom. And this is, of course, we see the ministry of God working in the world like that, and then we're asked to join it. So we participate in the loving kindness of God so that we can help bring about shalom in our communities, bring about peace, and bring about you know, all of the things that come with a complete and happy and whole society. And then it's interesting because when we look at the specific ministry of Jesus, when he sort of makes his sort of grand announcement, hey, I'm going into ministry, of course, he says that he's come to provide freedom to the captives. And so this freedom to the captives, that picture from Isaiah that he's painting there is about the year of the Lord, the year of Jubilee. And so the idea of Jubilee is in part that everything that had sort of veered off path in unjust ways was to be set right. And so Jesus's ministry was to set right the various things that had gone wrong because of the way that humans have acted towards one another, towards the planet, and all of that. So that's kind of the ancient way of looking at it. You could also read in Aristotle that for him, everybody gets their due. That's what he considers justice. And so for Christians, we have to think about, well, what is really somebody's due? And we would hopefully say that their due is love and respect and mercy and all of this, not necessarily because they've earned it, as none of us have earned grace, but because it's God's free gift that God pours out. And so we get to participate in that. In the more modern context, I think a lot of people would point to Howard Zerr's work from sort of the Anabaptist tradition. He brought sort of the phrase restorative justice into popularity. He's got a book that's kind of the gold standard for restorative justice, that just a little thin little book, easy to read, but he brought this series of practices into modern discussions in the West, at least, where most of our jurisprudence is influenced by sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so he said, well, you know, if we're going to be influenced by that, if we're acting as Christians, why not work towards restorative models in our criminal justice system instead of merely punitive models? And so that's kind of the modern basis for it. And then within our tradition, many of the folks listening, the Churches of Christ, we actually find a lot of parallels in the earliest parts of the Restoration movement, where folks were working towards peace. Of course, some of them even wanted to get rid of government, like David Lipscomb, or at least didn't want Christians participating because he was worried about this heavy-handedness of people being pushed down and punished, and instead was looking for a just community. And he thought that the church would be at the center of a just community, of a peaceable community, of a grace-filled community. And so even in our own tradition, we can find resources there about restorative justice.
That's great. So as we kind of look at the modern context, you know, especially politically, we see a lot of calls for law and order and things like that. And that perspective is really attractive, especially to some Christians. But yet, kind of what you were just talking about seems to be more of a foundation there for these restorative alternatives. Why do you think that's kind of won the day or won the argument right now in a lot of people's minds as far as this concept of law and order versus restoration?
This, I don't know if I'd quite say cynical, but the realist part of me says that it often comes down to racism and classism. The people that are being incarcerated are predominantly poor folks and particularly people of color. And so when we say law and order, it's often a way of saying, let's keep poor folks and people of color locked away from society. And there's a whole history of this. You can read up anything like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. There's a ton of resources out there, but they kind of show how policing in America began in the Reconstruction in the South. And there's this whole movement towards trying to find ways to take former slaves and make them slaves again. So this is where we get the middle of the 13th Amendment says, you know, basically slavery shouldn't exist except if someone is convicted of a crime. And so it was a way of working in, okay, even though we can't have slavery, we can still have slavery by folks who are in prison. So you get chain gangs, you get government contracts with prison. Anybody who's watched Shawshank Redemption can see how that works. And in our immediate moment, I think the idea of talking about law and order is something that's frankly convenient. If the people that I think are the bad people, whoever that might be, are locked up who are put away from society, I don't have to think about their needs, their wants, their humanity even. And so I think that's won the day for those reasons, and because it's something that our political system has latched onto. It's very difficult for people to get elected to a lot of offices unless they talk about law and order, because there's this perception that if they don't, then they're, weak on crime or whatever. But the reality is actually that you can have a very serious take on crime and think that there's better ways to deal with that than the sort of law and order method. I could go on about that, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, so I want to kind of piggyback off that, because I think a lot of it is the perception that it's kind of a wishy-washy, not hold your feet to the fire type of justice when it comes to restorative justice. So speak a little bit to that, to people who may have concerns, if that's what we're talking about. How is restorative justice process more effective in terms of actually turning people away from other bad behavior?
Well, just one simple way of looking at it is that the majority of folks who are incarcerated come back to their communities. So if we want to talk about just that reality of the folks who've been in jail, been in prison, and then come back to their communities, do we want to just have punished them, which then often leads them to looking towards either more ways to rebel or fight back, or for folks who don't know what their opportunities might be or might not have opportunities once they get out, then it's real easy for them to go back and to go back into their life of crime with more anger than they had before, right? When you're treated unjustly, when you're punished in a way that isn't about trying to help you grow as a person, that tends to breed anger and hate and breeds violence. So I think that's one key aspect of it that we just need to think about even practically. But then there's another aspect that people who have been incarcerated, if they're in a restorative model, there's sort of three stakeholders in the model. So you'd have the perpetrator of the crime, the victim or victims of the crime, and then you have the wider community in which a crime took place. And so in a restorative justice model, it's how can we help the person who's committed the crime become the kind of person who won't commit crimes in the future. The person who's been a victim or people who've been victims of crime, it's actually really a healing process. In the restorative justice program, Bridges to Life, that I've worked with, a lot of the volunteers for that are victims of crime. One of the leaders, Jim Buffington, I won't share his whole story because his to share, but the short of it is his dad had supposedly put out a hit on his mom and he and his brother. And after this whole convoluted tale, now Jim talks and leads this ministry as a victim of crime. And it's been healing for him. That's one thing you'll see every time I've heard him tell this story. It's always about how there's been this healing process. So it not only helps people not commit more crimes. In fact, Bridges to Life, their recidivism rate of people who have graduated their program is somewhere around 15%. And I believe the national average of recidivism rates is somewhere around 50%. It varies, by states. Red states tend to have more recidivism, blue states, but it varies for all sorts of different reasons. But they've gotten in their program down to about 15%. So 85% of the people who come through their program don't reoffend. And that's a pretty good number. And then along with that, they become the kind of people who participate in helping other people work through this program, and then also healing for the victims. So there's the two. And then the third one is the wider community. With a lot of these restorative justice programs, they not only think about how can we help people while they're incarcerated, how can we help make that a more just environment while they're there, but also what resources can we give them for when they re-enter the community. So maybe it's an education, not only an education about themselves, but maybe like Lipscomb University has a really great program where they work in the prison and they have degree programs. And so folks can spend their time in prison, get anywhere from a GED to, you know, I don't know, maybe a master's or more in some prison programs. And they come out with resources now. And with an organization like Bridges to Life, everyone who graduates in this program gets access to this database of other ministries and organizations that can help them find jobs, because stigma is attached to somebody who's been incarcerated. Being incarcerated that makes it very difficult for people to get jobs. But because Bridges to Life's program's been so successful, for instance, they can recommend, hey, this person graduated our program and you know our program's success, so would you take a chance and give this person a job, right? So sum it all up, restorative justice actually helps all the different stakeholders involved, whereas a more punitive route often doesn't really help anybody. Maybe some victims, you know, get a sense of relief or whatever if you know, somebody's committed a heinous crime, gets put in prison, but that might be it, you know, and you get somebody off the streets that's hurting someone, but we don't actually address the real root issues of forgiveness, of healing, of reconciliation. And our communities, I think, are less safe when we work off primarily a punitive model instead of a restorative model.
Yeah, and I think you've seen that. I mean, there's been in several states some bipartisan support for this, because it's not necessarily a blue or red issue. When people see the outcomes of some of these programs, they recognize the effectiveness, and it's kind of hard to argue with that, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about kind of the criminal justice context. As we think about the congregation, the church, I mean, obviously people could volunteer for organizations like Bridges to Life and things like that. But if someone was interested in learning more about restorative justice or getting involved or applying restorative justice, what are some practical tips that you might have to engage that in the church context?
Well, the first few I would point to is look up an organization that's already doing this. So Bridges to Life is in about a dozen states and a few foreign countries, and they're looking always to expand. In Nashville, there's a group called No Exceptions Prison Collective. They do a lot of great work. For folks who are familiar with Shane Claiborne, he's worked with them as they've been trying to persuade the governor there to take people off of death row and all that. So certainly look up, see what organizations are around. For folks who are connected to the academy, so if college students are listening to this, I highly recommend that they see if there's something their school can do about it. If their school's not already, see if they can push to get a restorative justice class taught. See if, in fact, Bridges to Life has an arm, a branch in Abilene. So for ACU students who are there in Abilene, it's an option, and maybe you could bring it into the curriculum. Some schools have whole programs where you take a number of different classes around restorative justice. So for students listening, and maybe even professors, really push that in your academic community and see if you can bring that about. Also, advocacy is really important. So all of the different ways that people can advocate, whether, you know, writing to the powers that be, whether it's protesting, you know, all the different ways folks can advocate. that's an important one. And then on sort of a more personal level, I think there's one really important thing that we need to do in sort of our introspection, is that we need to fight the urge to equate justice with punishment. That is something that so many of us, we've just grown up, that's the natural sort of order of things, it seems, that punishment is equal to justice. And we need to think about, it's kind of incarceration and the punitive model is kind of the inverse of the golden rule. So rather than do unto others, you have them do unto you, it's, do unto others the exact thing you would not want done to you, right? And so as Christians, we should at least take that part seriously, and we do some introspection about, okay, let's say, oh, well, here's a good example. So Bridges to Life, for instance, starts off their new program every year, and they put people in two groups, and they say, imagine you are a perpetrator of crime and you've just been arrested. What's going through your mind? And they write up on a board, all the different things. And then they say, imagine you've been a victim of a crime and it's just happened. What's going through your mind? And what's interesting, and then every time they do this, you look at those two lists and they're almost identical, right? There's fear, there's worry, there's confusion, there's all of these things on both ends. And so already we have some common ground in which we can begin to work off of. And so then I would also add that a lot of prisons, a lot of places have programs where you can do, like pen pal kind of things. There's programs that help get books into prison. I said education is a huge part of restorative justice. In fact, Malcolm X, when he was incarcerated for a variety of crimes he'd committed early on in his life, he was involved in pimping and drug dealing and various things. In prison, that he came across all this reading. He just did a bunch of reading, and when he came out, he had a new mindset on life, and it was aimed at racial justice. And for whatever controversy there might be around someone like him, we can see that education and that reading changed the focus of his life. He still had a lot of the anger and all for what he'd seen and experienced, but he was now trying to turn that towards a more just society, even if some folks might not always agree with the way he did that. And finally, this is a big one. Visit a jail or a prison. There's a variety of ways to do that, and it's going to vary by location, but some of them, depending on why you're visiting, you can go through, they do like a little safety course and all that kind of stuff. Some of them, it's maybe visiting someone in your community that you know about or that you might even know personally. So see if you can visit somebody who's locked up, because in that meeting, you can get to see some of the harsh reality of what incarceration looks like. I remember the first time I ever went into jail, and all of the metal detectors and all of that, and then we walked down this staircase into the area where folks were incarcerated. And I mean, I started feeling like this sense of panic, because it was closed in, it was miserable. And this was at a place that, wasn't really a small jail. They weren't really doing the more awful things like, locking folks up alone in a cell, in a cage by themselves. But even in that, I got just a little glimpse of what it might be like to be incarcerated. And so that helped change my mindset about how I would want to participate in this. If I take the golden rule seriously, how would I want to be treated if I committed the crime? Of course, some people say, well, you'd want to get off scot-free. And we're not advocating for that. But if you take it seriously, like, what would help me if I committed a crime? What would help me in the future to not commit crimes? What would help me in the future to get out of the difficult situation I was in, or whatever? and then think, okay, if that's the kind of stuff that would help me, then it makes sense that it would help the folks who are incarcerated, and then you work towards participating in those kinds of activities.
Yeah, and it's really the way that we think about treating people that we love most, right? When we think about someone that's done wrong to us, we might first want them to be punished or be held accountable, but we also want to try to find ways to lovingly restore a relationship.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way to think about it. If we really love our brothers and sisters, how we want them to be treated.
Well, we can think about it sort of within the context of a family. There's a difference between me disciplining my children and me punishing my children. When I discipline them, the goal is to teach them a lesson that a certain behavior is not appropriate, that teach them something about how to live as a whole human being and treat others well. But occasionally I lose my temper, right? And I yell at one of my kids, or I make them go sit on their bed, and I don't have any lesson to teach them in that. In fact, when that happens, it's usually the lesson is I go back and I apologize for letting my temper get out of control, right? And so if we just think about the same thing with incarceration, we can think about the difference between discipline and punishment. And right now, so much of our system is set up for punishment. And just as I, as a father, have to go to my kids and say, I'm sorry, I think we as a society have to do penance and repentance and say we're sorry for the ways that we've treated people who've been incarcerated, especially in light of all of the disparities in our criminal justice system.
That's good. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, Justin. Is there anything that you want to add that we haven't covered, maybe that you feel like would be good to touch on?
Yeah, real quick, I want to talk about one of my favorite scriptures. In 1 Peter, there's this really weird, just like one mention that Jesus went and he preached to the souls in hell or Hades, and read myriad interpretations of that. And I don't know what it actually means, but what I do get from it is that Jesus was willing to go to the lowest place possible. He was willing to go to where folks were not just imprisoned, but where folks were imprisoned in the underworld, in the afterlife, in hell, in Hades, and to go there as part of his ministry of releasing captives. And so I think if we take something like that seriously, even with all the complexities around the interpretation of that, that we be willing to go into places as Christians that some of the rest of society might not be willing, so that we can work towards the release of captives. I don't know if you want right now for me to also give you a few resources for folks, but I can do that as well. I highly recommend reading Bayard Rustin's account. Bayard Rustin is who I'm doing my dissertation on, and he was Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentor in nonviolence. He organized the March on Washington, a whole bunch of other incredible things, and his life's kind of been forgotten, but he spent 22 days on a chain gang for participating in some actions in North Carolina where they were trying to integrate the bus systems and all of that. And he writes an account of this, and what's really compelling about his account is he talks about how he brought what we would kind of think of as restorative justice practices. He brought those with him, and in only 22 days, he tells about all the shifts that happen in the prison mentality, how there's even a sort of friendliness rapport that he built with these guards that, stand out on the side of the road with their shotgun, waiting for somebody to get out of line. So I highly recommend that. You can just Google Bayard Rustin 22 Days on a Chain Gang, but it's also in a book called Time on Two Crosses, which is a collection of his writings. I already mentioned the Bridges to Life, but I recommend going on their website, not only to find out where they're located, if they're located near you, but also because I think it's worth ordering their little curriculum book. It's only $5, I think, and you can see how it works, but also it's a book that's about introspection mostly. So all of us have hurt people in our lives, and all of us have been hurt by people in our lives. So it just varies by degree, right? Some of us have said a mean word to our spouse. other people have murdered someone. Like there's a huge spectrum, but we've all hurt somebody and we've all been hurt by somebody, and their curriculum revolves kind of around those two elements. And so it can help each of us be introspective. And then I mentioned the No Exceptions Prison Collective in Nashville. Their website's noexceptions.net. And rather than rattling off a bunch of books I'd recommend, most of the books I have that I'd recommend are actually on their page. So you can look in their resources section on noexceptions.net, and you can find a fair number of books and other media resources that would help. And then there's the Netflix documentary, I think it's called College Behind Bars. Highly recommend watching that and looking at how folks who've been convicted of any number of awful crimes, how it's changing their lives to be cared about, to be loved, and to receive an education. And then some of their stories that follows them once they've been released from incarceration, and you see them getting really incredible jobs and things like this. So I highly recommend, if you're not a big reader, that you watch that documentary series. I think I'm right that it's on Netflix, but it's called College Behind Bars.
That's great. I hope that our watchers will take advantage of those resources. What about getting in contact with you? What's ways that they can see what you're doing next and see kind of more of those edited works that you're publishing, things like that?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's Rogue, ROGUE, rogueminister.org. And folks can go there. I've got a list of publications and future projects. We also have on there a podcast that a link to a podcast my wife and I do. And that podcast is us mostly just interviewing people who are involved in what we think are interesting ministries. So everything from a lady who helps young pregnant moms, work through all the things they need to work through, to friends of ours who are overseas in Honduras, working in the midst of abject poverty, and a whole wide range in between. We have scholars, we have practitioners, so folks can check that out through my website as well. And
the best part about the website, you could see the before picture of your beard, so that's also something worth checking.
Yes.
Out. Wow.
Yeah, when it wasn't quite this. Yeah.
Yeah.
That picture, one of the pictures on there is from many years ago. I was an article was written in the Atlantic about people who had taken too much student loans to become ministers. And I was featured in that article as one of the people who had taken too much student loans and was not finding, the monetary return on investment. But I'd say I'm absolutely getting more than I could bargain for the work that I've gotten to be in now. But anyway, yeah. So that's where that picture came from several years ago when I was a little more not clean shaven, but a little bit less crazy looking, perhaps.
Yeah, this view goes way better with Rogue Minister, so I think you definitely need to update the picture there.
Yeah, I love the name Rogue Minister. I was talking to my father-in-law years ago, and it was at a time when he was kind of just filling in at multiple churches around Nashville, and he used some other language I don't remember, but basically kind of traveling preacher. And so I got to thinking about that, and it's like, I think describing myself as rogue, I tend to go rogue a fair bit. And as a rogue minister who wants to go off sort of the beaten path, do things maybe not quite the way that they're supposed to be done, if it's going to be a way that we can show love and grace and mercy and peaceableness, justice to other folks. So yeah, I've loved that name. So in fact, our podcast is the Rogue Ministry Podcast. So
awesome. That's
yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate the conversation, and we look forward to hearing more from you and from your writings and research in the future. So God bless.
Absolutely. This was a blast. Thank you so much.